Hello, everybody. It is To Kill a Mockingbird, and we are on chapter 21. When last we were reading, um, we were at the trial of Tom Robinson, and Atticus had just finished his closing statements. It seems impossible for them to find Tom guilty of this crime. Mayella, who is the one who she and her dad accusing Tom of raping her, had clearly been beaten by somebody who was left-handed. The right side of her face showed bruises and all kinds of problems. She also had been choked, and that would be not just one hand around the neck, but the two hands around the neck. Now, they did say that she was small and you could probably get just one hand. But one would think in order to choke someone, you would need more than just one hand to somehow subdue them as you were choking. So Tom has a left hand that got caught in a cotton gin when he was a kid. It stopped growing. They say it's 12 inches shorter than the other arm. He has no muscle control in it or anything at all like that. So it seems impossible that he's going to be found guilty. When we last finished, we had Calpurnia coming into the courtroom, probably looking for those kids because they are not supposed to be there, and she could not find them. So we're going to jump right into page 276. She stopped shyly at the railing and waited to get Judge Taylor's attention. She was in a fresh apron, and she carried an envelope in her hand. Judge Taylor saw her and said, "It's Calpurnia, isn't it?" "Yes, sir," she said. "Could I just pass this note to Mr. Finch, please? Hasn't got anything to do with the trial." Judge Taylor nodded, and Atticus took the envelope from Calpurnia. He opened it, he read its contents, and he said, "Judge, this note is from my sister. She says my children are missing. Haven't turned up since noon. Could you—" "I know where they are, Atticus," Mr. Underwood spoke up. "They're right up yonder in the colored balcony. Been there since precisely 1:18 p.m. Our father turned around and looked up. "Jim, come down here," he called. Then he said something to the judge we didn't hear. We climbed across Reverend Sachs and made our way to the staircase. Atticus and Calpurnia met us downstairs. Calpurnia looked peeved. Atticus, he just looked exhausted. Jim was jumping in excitement. "We've won, haven't we?" "I have no idea," Atticus said shortly. "You've been here all afternoon? Now go home with Calpurnia and get your supper, and stay home." "Oh, Atticus, let us come back," pleaded Jim. "Please, just let us hear the verdict. Please, sir." "The jury might be out and back in a minute. We don't know." But we could tell Atticus was relenting. "Well, you've heard it all, so you might as well hear the rest. I'll tell you what, you all can come back when you've eaten your supper. Eat slowly now. You won't miss anything important. And if the jury's still out, then you can wait with us. But I expect it'll be over before you get back." "You think they'll acquit him that fast?" asked Jim. Atticus opened his mouth to answer, but shut it, and he left us. I prayed that Reverend Sachs would save our seats for us, but stopped praying when I remembered that people got up and left in droves when the jury was out. Tonight they'd overrun the drugstore, the OK Cafe, the hotel, that is, unless they'd brought their own suppers too. Calpurnia marched us home. "Skin every one of you alive." Very idea. The children listened to all that. "Mr. Jim, you don't know better than to take your little sister to that trial. Miss Alexandra will absolutely have a stroke of paralysis when she finds out. Ain't fitting for children to hear." The street lights were on, and we glimpsed Calpurnia's indignant profile as we passed beneath them. "Mr. Jim, I thought you was getting some kind of head on your shoulders. The very idea. She's your little sister. The very idea, Sue. You ought to be perfectly ashamed of yourself. Ain't you got any sense at all?" I was exhilarated. So many things had happened so fast I felt it would take years to sort them all out. And now here was Calpurnia giving her precious Jim down the country. What new marvels would the evening bring? Jim was chuckling. Don't you want to hear about it, Cal? Hush your mouth, sir. When you ought to be hanging your head in shame, you go along laughing. Calpurnia revived a series of rusty threats that moved Jim to little remorse. She sailed up the front steps with her classic, "If Mr. Finch won't wear you out, I will. I'll get in that house, sir." Jim went in grinning, and Calpurnia nodded tacit consent to having Dill into supper. "You all call Miss Rachel right now, and you tell her where you are," she told him. "She's run distracted looking for you. You watch out that you don't sit back to Meridian first thing in the morning." Aunt Alexandra met us and nearly fainted when Calpurnia told her where we were. I guess it hurt her when we told her Atticus said that we could go back, because she didn't say a word during supper. She just rearranged food on her plate, looking at it sadly while Calpurnia served Jim, Dill, and me with a vengeance. Calpurnia poured milk, dished out potato salad and ham, and muttered, "Ashamed of yourselves," in varied degrees of intensity. "Now you all eat slow," was her final command. Reverend Sachs had saved our places, and we were surprised to find that we had been gone nearly an hour, and were equally surprised to find the courtroom exactly as we left it, with minor changes. The jury box was empty, and the defendant was gone. Judge Taylor had been gone, but he reappeared as we were seating ourselves. "Nobody's moved hardly," said Jim. "They moved around some when the jury went out," said Reverend Sachs. "Men folk down there got the women folk their suppers. They fed their babies." "How long have they been out?" asked Jim. "About 30 minutes. Mr. Finch, Mr. Gilmore did some more talking, and Judge Taylor charged the jury." "How was he?" asked Jim. "What say?" "Oh, well, he did right well. I ain't complaining one bit. He was mighty fair-minded. He sort of said, if you believe this, then you have to return one verdict, but if you believe this, you have to return another one." "I thought he was leaning a little to our side." Reverend Sachs scratched his head, and Jim said, "He's not supposed to lean, Reverend, but don't fret. We've won it," he said wisely. "Don't see how any jury could convict on what we heard." "Don't you be so confident, Mr. Jim. I ain't ever seen any jury decide in favor of a colored man over a white man." But Jim took exception to Reverend Sachs, and we were subjected to a lengthy review of the evidence with Jim's idea on the law regarding rape. It wasn't rape if she let you, but if she had to be 18, in Alabama that is, and Mayella was 19, apparently you had to kick and holler. You had to be overpowered and stomped on, preferably knocked stone cold, and if you were under 18, you didn't have to go through all this. "Mrs. Jim," Reverend Sachs demurred, "this ain't a polite thing for little ladies to hear." "Oh, she doesn't know what we're talking about," said Jim. "Scout, this is too old for you, ain't it?" "Well, it most certainly is not. I know every word you're saying." Perhaps I was too convincing, because Jim hushed and never discussed the subject again. "What time is it, Reverend?" he asked. "Getting on toward 8. I looked out, and I saw Atticus strolling around with his hands in his pocket. He made a tour of the windows, and then walked by the railing over to the jury box. He looked in it, inspected Judge Taylor on his throne, and then went back to where he started. I caught his eye and waved to him. He acknowledged my salute with a nod, and resumed his tour. Mr. Gilmore was standing at the window talking to Mr. Underwood. Bert, the court reporter, was chain-smoking. He sat back with his feet on the table. But the officers of the court, the ones present, Atticus, Mr. Gilmore, Judge Taylor, sound asleep, and Bert, were the only ones whose behavior seemed normal. I'd never seen a packed courtroom so still. Sometimes a baby would cry out fretfully, and a child would scurry out, but the grown people sat as if they were in church. In the balcony, the Negroes sat and stood around us with biblical patience. The old courthouse clock suffered its preliminary strain and struck the hour. 8 deafening bongs that shook our bones. And when it bonged 11 times, I was past feeling, tired from fighting sleep. I allowed myself a short nap against Reverend Sachs' comfortable arm and shoulder. I jerked awake, and I made an honest effort to remain so by looking down and concentrating on the heads below. There were 16 bald ones, 14 men who could pass for redheads, 40 heads varying between brown and black, and I remembered something Jim had once explained to me when he went through a brief period of physical research. He said if enough people, a stadium full maybe, were to concentrate on one thing, such as setting a tree afire in the woods, that the tree would ignite of its own accord. I toyed with the idea of asking everyone below to concentrate on setting Tom Robinson free, but thought they were as tired as I was, it wouldn't work. Now Dale was sound asleep, his head on Jim's shoulder, and Jim was quiet. "Ain't it a long time?" I asked him. "Sure is, Scout," he said happily. "Well, from the way you put it, it'd just take 5 minutes." Jim raised his eyebrows. There are things you don't understand," he said, and I was too wary to argue. But I must have been reasonably awake, or I would not have received the impression that was creeping into me. It was not unlike one I'd had last winter, and I shivered, though the night was hot. The feeling grew until the atmosphere in the courtroom was exactly the same as a cold February morning, when the mockingbirds were still, and the carpenters had stopped hammering on Miss Maudie's new house, and every wood door in the neighborhood was shut as tight as the doors of the Radley place. A deserted, waiting, empty street, and the courtroom was packed with people. A steaming summer night was no different from a winter morning. Mr. Heck Tate, who had entered the courtroom and was talking to Atticus, might have been wearing his high boots and lumber jacket. Atticus had stopped his tranquil journey and put his foot in the bottom rung of a chair as he listened to what Mr. Tate was saying, and he ran his hand slowly up and down his tie. I expected Mr. Tate to say in a minute, "Take him, Mr. Finch." But Mr. Tate said, "This court will come to order," in a voice that rang with authority, and the heads below us jerked up, and Mr. Tate left the room and returned with Tom Robinson. He steered Tom to his place beside Atticus, and he stood there. Judge Taylor had roused himself to sudden alertness, and was sitting up straight, looking at the empty jury box. What happened after that had a dreamlike quality. In a dream I saw the jury return, moving like underwater swimmers, and Judge Taylor's voice came from far away and was tiny. I saw something only a lawyer's child could be expected to see, could be expected to watch for, and it was like watching Atticus walk into the street and raise a rifle to his shoulder and pull the trigger, but watching all the time knowing that the gun was empty. A jury never looks at a defendant it's convicted, and when this jury came in, not one of them looked at Tom Robinson. The foreman handed a piece of paper to Mr. Tate, who handed it to the clerk, who handed it to the judge. I shut my eyes. Judge Taylor was polling the jury. Guilty, 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 guilty. I peeked at Jim. His hands were white from gripping the balcony rail, and his shoulders jerked as if each guilty was a separate stab between them. Judge Taylor was saying something. His gavel was in his fist, but he wasn't using it. Dimly I saw Atticus pushing papers from the table into his briefcase. He snapped it shut, he went to the court reporter and said something, nodded to Mr. Gilmore, and he went to Tom Robinson and whispered something to him. Atticus put his hand on Tom's shoulder as he whispered. Atticus took his coat off the back of his chair, pulled it over his shoulder. Then he left the courtroom, but not by his usual exit. He must have wanted to go home the short way, because he walked quickly down the middle aisle toward the south exit. I followed the top of his head as he made his way to the door, but he didn't look up. Someone was punching me, but I was reluctant to take my eyes from the people below us and from the image of Atticus's lonely walk down the aisle. "Miss Jean Louise." I looked up. They were standing. All around us in the balcony on the opposite wall, the Negroes were getting to their feet. Reverend Sachs's voice was as distant as Judge Taylor. "Miss Jean Louise, stand up. Your father's passing." And Tom is found guilty. You know, Jim keeps saying, "Oh, you don't understand, Scout. You'll understand one day." I think that he did understand. He understood that the longer that the jury was out, the better chance that Tom had of getting off and of being free. There was little to no chance that a white jury was going to find him innocent and disagree with a white man. I guess if there ever was a possibility of it happening, Tom Robinson against the Ewells came the closest to it actually maybe happening. But prejudice is deep, and Tom Robinson never really had a chance, even though it is apparent he didn't do it. How heartbreaking is that? The only solace is that the jury was out for as long as they were, which showed that they understood he should have been found innocent, but they couldn't bring themselves to do it. They just couldn't. Very sad. I want to talk for a second about the idea of the title, To Kill a Mockingbird, and when Atticus had given Jem a gun for Christmas, he said, "Shoot at whatever you want, but do not shoot at a mockingbird." And Miss Maudie said, "Because the mockingbirds don't do anything bad. They just are there and they sing. They don't cause any damage. They don't do anything bad. So it's a sin. It's a sin to kill something that does nothing bad to you." And so we are getting, my friends, into the last parts of this book, and it's going to go very fast. Remember also that it started out with Jem and Scout having a discussion as they're older with how Jem broke his arm. And one says it happened, it was because of the Ewells. And one said it was Boo Radley. And we haven't heard from Boo Radley or about Boo Radley in a very long time. So, as we venture into the other chapters, we're going to start seeing all of these things come together. So don't forget to take your quiz, and when we come back, we're going to find out much more about what's going on, how Scout feels about it, and how this verdict changes her.